Hi everyone. My name is Brittany Crowley. I'm a first-year doctoral student in the clinical psychology program over in Curry. And just full disclosure, these results I'm going to present today aren't the ones that were funded by the PVI collective. This is sort of a part one that inspired me into do the second study, which was then funded by the PVI collective, but that one's not quite finished and still in the data collection stage. So I'll be talking to you a little bit about the one which is very conceptually similar. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about my PVI study. So I will be talking to you today, as Nick said, about the effects of shackling and age on perceptions of juvenile defendants in court. So I think, at least in my field of psychology, it's common to look at various factors that can impact the perceptions of individuals, and specifically in my field, kind of the psycholegal field, we can look a lot at perception, or at factors that can impact perceptions of people in court. But this idea of thinking about shackling as one of those factors might be kind of new to a lot of people. So you'll hear me talking a lot today about this policy called indiscriminate juvenile shackling. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means first. So when we talk about juvenile shackling, we're talking about the practice of placing juvenile defendants in restraints when they attend court. When we're talking about indiscriminate juvenile shackling, we're talking about shackling all the juvenile defendants, regardless of individual characteristics, such as their age, their risk of violence they might pose, or the type of crime that they're even being charged for. And so theoretically, what this means in a state that practices indiscriminate juvenile shackling, for example, a 12-year-old girl accused of a nonviolent crime like shoplifting would be shackled the same as a 16-year-old boy accused of a violent crime like assault. So, I want to clarify that all states in the U.S. permit shackling, like discriminate shackling, on a case-by-case basis when necessary, such as if someone is extremely violent or something like that, and it needs to happen. But we also see that 21 states in the U.S. permit indiscriminate shackling. So those, is this showing up kind of grayish-purple? So those are the kind of grayish-purple ones. Are the 21 states that permit indiscriminate shackling. And the ones in the kind of bluish, like California and those ones, are the ones that limit indiscriminate shackling. And they can do that in a variety of ways. It can be a legal statute that limits the ability to do that, and it can also be, for example, a judicial limit, like a court opinion or a judge's rule over their court that says kids can't always be shackled. But we do see, though, that this is a pretty divided issue in the U.S. So we're looking at a pretty solid split in terms of the policy implications of who is shackling kids and who isn't. Now, there's a lot of arguments on either side of this issue as to whether or not this is an okay thing to do. So the main argument in support of indiscriminately shacking juvenile defendants is safety. So there's an assumption that that juveniles are kind of volatile, by virtue of their youth, and that especially when they're going into a stressful situation like delinquency court, they could pose a risk to other people. So it's better to just preemptively restrain them to protect everyone in the courtroom and potentially themselves if they're at risk of harming themselves as well. Now, on the other side of things, the arguments against indiscriminate shackling, probably the most common and logical reason to argue against indiscriminate shackling of juveniles is that indiscriminate shackling of adults is already prohibited throughout the U.S. So this has been discussed in a lot of court cases, especially in the past 30 years. But as you'll see by this quote at the bottom, this topic of indiscriminate shackling has actually been discussed since the 1800s, and they have pretty much established from the beginning that it's unfair to shackle everybody all the time. Yet we see that this policy exists to shackle juveniles. In the Supreme Court case Deck versus Missouri in 2005, this was one of the most noteworthy examples of a court case that ruled, speaking only of adults, that they cannot be shackled unless it's really, really necessary, like if they're really violent. but they made no mention of juveniles in this case. There are other arguments that people make, more theoretical arguments as to why this might be a bad idea. The one I'm going to look at is this bias argument. A lot of people think that shackling juveniles when they go to court could create a bias of guilt or dangerousness against them, and so that's the one I wanted to look at specifically and thought I could investigate empirically. But it's important to remember that no matter which side of this debate you're on, there's no empirical evidence investigating any of the arguments on either side. So that's why I wanted to study this topic. So I decided to look at shackling, and I picked another variable to kind of pair with it. I thought defendant age was a nice relevant. It's obviously salient because there is research that juveniles of different ages have very different, perceptions and very different outcomes in the juvenile justice system. So I thought it would be interesting to pair the two. So with that in mind, I had a few main research questions. One, I wanted to know, how does courtroom shackling, defendant age, and the potential interaction of the two variables influence perceptions of juvenile defendants? And I also wanted to know, do people support this policy of indiscriminate juvenile shackling, and why or why not? So what's their rationale? So what I did was I had an online study, collected 195 participants from Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which is an online data collection platform. And what I did was I had 6 photo conditions, and each participant was randomly selected to see one of the conditions. And these conditions were, you would either see a 12-year-old, a 16-year-old, or a 20-year-old, so that's the age piece, and then they would be either shackled or unshackled. So the example I have here, you have one of each age. From left to right is 12, 16, and 20, and this is the shackling condition. You can see that they have leg irons, handcuffs, and they also have belly chains, which is usually how they go to court, at least in Charlottesville, which is one of the cities that does shackling. And so the unshackled condition would have looked similar to this, except they would have just had their hands at their sides. And so after participants saw the photo, I asked them to rate various perceptions of the defendant, like dangerousness, guilt, blameworthiness, etc. Then I gave them a brief definition of indiscriminate juvenile shackling policy, asked them to rate their support of it, so how much do they agree or disagree with this policy. And then I also had this thing called a belief in a just world scale, where I basically provided participants with a measure that was supposed to assess how much you believe that the world is a just place where people generally get what they deserve. And you'll see when I talk a little bit about my results that I thought that this would be sort of linked to support for shackling policy. So I've kind of alluded to this already, but to state the hypotheses more directly, for age, we expected harsher judgments against older defendants, and this has been pretty established in legal literature already. For the shackling one, that we had no basis for this hypothesis, but based on, again, the bias assumption that we're testing, we expected harsher judgments against shackled defendants. And then with the interaction, I kind of expected that there would be an effect of shackling such that the effect of shackling would be strongest for the youngest defendant, perhaps in sort of a theoretical mindset that, like, if this little kid had to be shackled, he must be really dangerous instead of a bigger kid, like, it might make a little more sense. So that was my thought there. And for support of indiscriminate juvenile shackling policy, expected varied support, and I thought that it might change against demographic categories like political affiliation and also maybe that belief in a just world scale that I mentioned. So to talk a little bit about the results, we did not find as strong of a shackling effect that we were expecting. Only one of our 10 perception items was statistically significant on the effect of shackling, but the one that was pretty interesting. So it was the dangerousness item, so we found that shackled defendants were viewed as slightly more dangerous than unshackled defendants. For age effects, as hypothesized, participants rated older defendants more harshly, so that's pretty consistent and wasn't super novel or exciting. We found no interaction of age with shackling status, which was, again, not what we were expecting, but it does, contribute to kind of this idea of like how we're thinking about this. Maybe there's not an effect, and maybe we just didn't find it. With the age effects, you'll see that all of these items, so all 10 perception items, were statistically significant, such that older defendants were viewed more harshly. In terms of support for IJS policy, we saw a pretty solid split, which was kind of consistent with the split we're actually seeing at the policy level in the US. So 43% of the sample disagreed, so they did not support indiscriminate shackling. 48% agreed and said, yes, I to some degree do support this policy, and 9% were undecided. And then I ran a follow-up regression just to see what characteristics of participants were predictive of support for shackling. And so we found that political orientation and belief in a just world were the strongest predictors, such that participants who were more politically conservative and who believed that the world is a just place where people generally get what they deserve were more likely to endorse shackling policies. The last thing we did was, after I presented the definition of shackling and asked them about their degree of support for it, I had an open-ended question where they could offer their rationale for why they supported or didn't support the policy. And so I qualitatively coded their open-ended responses, and this ended up yielding about 8 dominant themes that sort of split evenly across pro-shackling rationales and anti-shackling rationales. So I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I will point out a couple of the highest frequency ones. So for pro-shackling rationales, the most commonly described rationale for supporting shackling was a concern with safety, which kind of makes sense, again, when we're thinking about the probably most dominant theoretical argument for why we should shackle kids. So 65 of our participants demonstrated some sort of concern with safety or dangerousness or risk of violence, said that maybe kids should be shackled because of this. Probably a more concerning one was the second one, which I called a punitive attitude as the rationale. So we saw that 18% of our sample expressed in their rationale for shackling some sort of retribution feeling. Things like shackling teaches these kids a lesson, or sort of a you do the crime, you do the time mentality, which I just found concerning because it's completely in contrast with the theoretical tenets of the juvenile court, which is supposed to be rehabilitative and supportive, and that's not what that is. For anti-shackling, the most commonly endorsed rationale for why we shouldn't indiscriminately shackle kids was crime type, so that maybe more violent kids, like kids who have been accused of felonies or violent crimes, should be shackled, but not all kids should be shackled. So just to kind of wrap up what we've talked about, I think this has a lot of potential implications for not just the research side of this shackling topic, but also the policy side. As I mentioned, Virginia is one of the states that does practice indiscriminate juvenile shackling, and Charlottesville itself shackles kids when they go to court. So this is relevant to our town as well as the larger political sphere. A couple of limitations to point out was we did have a concern about the ecological validity of this study. We weren't sure if, because with the participants were just viewing photos as opposed to actually experiencing, like seeing the juvenile defendant in court in person, we think that there maybe was a little bit of a weak stimulus, and that it's possible that there's no effect of shackling, but it's also possible that our stimulus just wasn't strong enough to pick up that effect. I also want to draw attention to the fact that the most ideal participant population to test this theory in would be juvenile court judges as opposed to lay people. And juvenile court judges are kind of a lot harder to get to do studies. But we're going to try for that, and I'll talk about that in a second. We're going to try for that in the follow-up study. So there's definitely need for more research on this, which brings me to my Part 2 study that I'm currently doing, funded by the PVI collective. So in this follow-up study, I'm looking at, so I decided to drop age as a variable because again, that's kind of more established. I'm looking at race this time, which I think is potentially even more salient and more relevant in our current climate. And I'm going to try to survey juvenile court judges in addition to lay people. It's, again, a harder sample to get, but that's what I'm going for, and that's part of the reason I don't have all my data yet. And the last thing that I'm doing in the second study is that we use video stimuli instead of photos, hoping that maybe like 30-second video of this kid in shackles would be a stronger stimulus, and maybe elicit a stronger shackling effect. So, yeah, thank you for your time.